Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Rich Flee and the Poor Take the Bus. How Our Unequal Society Fails Us During Outbreaks, by Troy Tassier, Ph.D. Narrated by David Thorpe.
Preface. At first, the deaths mounted slowly. Then, in late summer, they exploded across the city. By August 1625, there were upward of 4,000 people dying per week in a city with a population of only 300,000. Anyone who could afford to escape the plague distanced themselves from the crowded conditions of London. Newly crowned King Charles prohibited Londoners from entering Whitehall Palace. Parliament adjourned to Oxford. Others, who had enough wealth or a lucky opportunity, escaped to the countryside. Thomas Dekker, a playwright and pamphleteer, wrote A Rod for Runaways in protest of those who fled London. We are warranted by Holy Scriptures to fly from persecution, from the plague, and from the sword that pursues us. But you fly to save yourselves, and in that flight undo others. In part, Dekker was objecting to the wealthy carrying the plague to those who lived in the countryside. He demonstrated this harm in the illustration that adorns the cover of his pamphlet. He reserved his strongest words, however, for the financial undoing of the poor who were left behind in the city. When the wealthy left London, shops closed, churches and charities did not receive alms. The price of bread and grain soared. The economy collapsed. Dekker's rod of punishment was raised against the rich for their financial abandonment of the poor as much as the contagion that they created in the countryside. He chastised the wealthy for not providing financial support for those who could not afford to flee to physical safety and for those who faced starvation. Eventually, King Charles intervened by levying a tax on those who fled, which he used to feed those who had been left behind. In Dekker's description of the plague in 1625, we see that the movements and behaviours of people and the financial circumstances of individuals determined who was safe and who was sick, who was financially secure and who was destitute. In London, the actions and interactions of people, their collective social norms and their individual beliefs, along with the king's policies, all help to determine the path of the plague and its economic consequences. Economics, epidemics and society were intricately intertwined in 1625. They are intertwined today as well. An old adage in epidemiology claims, if you've seen one epidemic, you've seen one epidemic. Just like each individual human being is unique, so is each epidemic. Yet there are regularities to human behaviour, and there are regularities to epidemics and how societies and individuals behave in response to them. While the details change over the years, one result is the same. Today, and in the past, the most physical and financial harm from epidemics falls upon the people who are least privileged and most marginalized. It is society's responsibility to protect such people when epidemics arrive. We often failed to live up to this responsibility in the past. We failed again with our response to COVID-19. To avoid this failure in the future, we must understand why this history repeats. Inequality, discrimination, racism, and a lack of financial security all magnify the harm done to vulnerable groups during epidemics. The linkages between these issues and epidemics are not always direct nor simple. They involve a tangled web of interactions among individuals, across communities, and society. These interactions are the pathways that allow epidemics to spread. But there are other factors too. Selfish decisions by individuals and firms can create epidemic harm for others, just as they did in Decker's time. Lack of access to high-quality healthcare leaves some individuals without preventative care, even before an epidemic, while others are without critical care after being infected. Still other people are forced to balance at the margins of poverty, left to choose between epidemic safety and financial survival. Many of the most marginalized face all of these issues simultaneously. By more clearly understanding how each of these issues are interconnected, we can better protect marginalized groups when an epidemic arrives. We cannot wait until the next epidemic strikes to address these issues. Universal access to high-quality healthcare, living wages for all workers, lower levels of socio-economic inequality, and more robust public health funding would prepare us for an epidemic in the future. These improvements would also create a more just society in the present. This book demonstrates why achieving these goals is important. I hope that it will inspire the changes that will bring these objectives to fruition. Chapter 1. The Most Important Letter. In 430 BCE, a unique malady arrived in the Athenian port of Piraeus soon after the onset of the Peloponnesian War. Strange and fatal symptoms cursed women, men, and children of normally good health. At first, the folk of Piraeus feared that the invading Spartans had poisoned their water reservoirs. Soon, however, they realized their crisis was much worse. The illness began to appear inland and spread among the people of a narrow, walled corridor that extended 6 kilometres from Piraeus to Athens. Here, the illness found masses of war refugees huddled in crowded, makeshift dwellings, while the Spartan army pillaged their homes outside the walls. The refugees never expected to find a second lethal foe waiting inside the walls. As the disease moved onward, near chaos ensued as the entire population from Piraeus to Athens was overcome with pestilence. Thucydides, the Athenian historian and general, was infected but survived. He described the onset of symptoms as violent heats in the head and redness and inflammation of the eyes, the inward parts such as the throat and tongue becoming bloody. Sneezing and hoarseness followed as the strange illness moved downward from the head to the torso. Pain soon settled in the chest and produced a hard cough before progressing to the stomach. Here, discharges of bile of every kind named by physicians ensued. Ineffectual retching followed, producing violent spasms. The bodies of those afflicted appeared reddish, livid, and breaking out into small pustules and ulcers. Internally, it burned so that the patient could not bear to have on him clothing or linen of even the lightest description. Death arrived to many in short order. Thucydides continued, "The catastrophe was so overwhelming that men, not knowing what would happen next to them, became indifferent to every rule of religion or of law." Over the next 3 years, at least 25% of the population of Athens would die, not from war, but from disease. The conditions that created this disaster had begun 3 decades prior. The epidemic was not simply a result of biology. Human behaviour played a dominant role too. In 461 BCE, as tensions mounted with Sparta, Athens began constructing a series of walls to defend its population against land invasion. When completed, the 8-metre-high, 6-kilometre-long stone and brick walls formed a corridor between the port of Piraeus and the city of Athens. With the weapons of the time, walls of this type were virtually impenetrable. The only hope an enemy had of overcoming such a barrier was to surround the city and then starve its people of necessities, thereby forcing surrender. The strength of the Athenian navy and its control of the surrounding seas prevented this from happening. Food and supplies arrived at Piraeus and were transported safely through the protected corridors to Athens. When Sparta invaded the countryside and attempted to surround Athens at the start of the war, the farmers and country folk of Attica fled their homes in an attempt to gain safety inside the long walls. As the war intensified, the population inside the walls exploded from 145,000 people to an estimated 500,000. As the refugees' numbers increased, Athens sent its ships to raid Spartan crops along the coast of the Peloponnese and to collect items for trade. They used proceeds from these raids to feed the masses of residents and refugees trapped within the long walls. Shortly thereafter, an epidemic arose in northern Africa near Ethiopia. It soon spread into Egypt and Libya. Given that the shipping industry was vital to the survival of Athens during the war, the epidemic soon found its way onto an Athenian ship and invaded the port at Piraeus. As people began to fall ill, some residents of Piraeus believed that their water had been poisoned by Sparta. But they soon realized that they faced a more dangerous reality. They were under attack from infectious disease. It feasted on the population crowded between the long walls. Thucydides wrote that when the war refugees arrived from the countryside, there were no houses to receive them. They had to be lodged in stifling cabins where the mortality raged without restraint. The bodies of dying men lay one upon the other, and half-dead creatures reeled about the streets. Although infectious disease had existed since time immemorial, this is the first record of the massive destruction of a population by epidemic disease. To this day, historians debate which infectious disease was responsible for the catastrophe. It may have been measles, smallpox, typhus, or bubonic plague. Or it may have been another pathogen that has faded from history and may be either extinct or not recognizable today. For centuries, episodes of infectious disease have added twists and turns to history, as well as turmoil to individual lives. The year 2019 will be remembered for the arrival of another illness. Beginning late in the year, the novel coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, began infecting unsuspecting citizens in Wuhan, China. By early 2020, the virus had circumvented the globe and enveloped society the world over with disease and fear. Although the plague of Athens and the plague of our time are separated by 25 centuries, there are parallels between them. In On the Nature of Things, Lucretius describes the plague of Athens as follows. "'Twas such a manner of disease, 'twas such mortal miasma in Cecropian lands. Whilom reduced the plains to dead men's bones, unpeopled the highways, drained of citizens the Athenian town. For coming from afar, rising in the lands of Egypt, traversing reaches of air and floating fields of foam, at last on all Pandion's folk it swooped." As in this description of Athens, the COVID-19 pandemic took people off the highways and emptied our great cities. It swooped upon us and arrived from afar over air and sea. It invaded our cities, towns, schools and homes. As it did so, everything in society changed across healthcare, economics, education and even politics. Despite this sweep of change in our lives, where everything seemed in turmoil and everything was different, there were many historical constants in how the epidemic behaved and how we behaved in response. The COVID-19 pandemic repeated patterns that historians had noted for centuries. In the 21st century, however, these experiences seemed new. Not since the 1918 influenza pandemic had we seen anything similar sweep the globe. As COVID-19 arrived, statements dotted newspapers claiming that this new pandemic would threaten everyone. Public figures, from New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo to pop star Madonna, referred to this new plague as the Great Equalizer, where everyone was equally at risk. We learned quickly, in the spring of 2020, however, that this pandemic was no Great Equalizer. In the first wave of the pandemic in the United States, people of colour died at rates 2 to 3 times greater than their white counterparts. Impoverished urban neighbourhoods faced higher rates of sickness and death than more affluent neighbourhoods that sat only a few blocks away. Young people and women more frequently lost their jobs as a result of the pandemic than did middle-aged workers and men. Those with high levels of education often transitioned to the safety of remote work in their homes. Service sector workers, however, if they were lucky enough to remain employed, faced a higher risk of infection in their crowded, in-person places of work. Everywhere one looked, the effects of the pandemic were unequal. Those at the margins of society paid the highest costs in terms of health and in terms of finances. This wasn't random or a case of bad luck. It was predictable. It was history repeated. Even the few who knew the history had hoped that this time would be different. We had more wealth and technology to fight a pandemic than ever before. Science, with its 21st century understanding of viruses, along with greater understanding of public health and epidemiology, might allow us to be spared. In addition, a more developed economic system and a greater social safety net sat poised to protect the economically disadvantaged. Yet these Panglossian optimists were fooled. Epidemic inequality prevailed everywhere we looked. It has been this way for centuries. In the 19th century, Naples was the largest city in Italy, with a population just under 500,000 people. This population was far from evenly spread across the city. The upper city sat within the hills surrounding the port. Its residents looked down, literally and figuratively, upon those living in the lower city along the northern shore of the Gulf of Naples. The upper city was sparsely populated and affluent, while the lower city was dense and impoverished. In the regions of the lower city with the greatest concentration of people, approximately 4,500 buildings housed 300,000 residents. In these small structures, as many as 7 people typically occupied only 5 square metres, a space that was barely big enough to allow each person to lie down. In addition to using these minimal dwellings for sleeping and eating, people often shared them with poultry. Running water and connections to a sewer system were non-existent. This meant that bathing for cleanliness was not an option, and clothes were washed in large communal troughs placed in narrow streets and dark alleys. Garbage and human waste, which were dumped through windows and trickled down damp, narrow alleys, pooled in the crevices of the uneven streets. One can imagine the stench. Light rarely reached inside these dwellings. It must have been like living in a cave, almost unable to see your surroundings. In addition to having these horrid living conditions, the lower city was an economic disaster. With so many people packed on top of each other and limited job opportunities, wages were severely depressed. According to epidemiological historian Frank Snowden, during a normal 10 to 12-hour workday, an unskilled male earned enough to buy 4 kilograms, about £9, of pasta, and 4 days of labour were needed to purchase a pair of shoes. These items were luxuries, however, which large swathes of the population could not afford, given that up to 40% of the city was permanently unemployed. When cholera arrived in Naples early in the 19th century, these dense and impoverished conditions within the lower city led to dramatic levels of epidemic infestation. During the 1884 epidemic, about 5,600 deaths were recorded among a population of about 460,000 people, which means that slightly more than 1% of the population died. These deaths were not evenly distributed across Naples. Almost 4,500 people died in the most crowded and poor lower city boroughs, Mercato, Pendino, Porto and Vicaria. While these were some of the most populous boroughs of Naples, they were home to about 190,000 of the 460,000 total population. That is, 80% of the deaths occurred in an area that contained only 40% of the population. These horrid conditions led Member of Parliament Renzo De Zerbi to label this area the death zone. All of the 19th century cholera epidemics in Naples followed this same pattern of concentration in the four most impoverished and densely populated boroughs. Economic inequality led to epidemic inequality. Today, it is easier to understand why an epidemic would spread so easily given the conditions of the lower city. Everything that leads to person-to-person contagion existed in Lower Naples in this time of residential congestion and minimal sanitation. However, the population at the time did not understand how infectious diseases were spread. The germ theory of disease was only in its infancy in the late 19th century. While an early understanding of contagion existed, perhaps since the time of the Black Death, it wasn't until the early 20th century that Ronald Ross developed the roots of modern mathematical epidemiology. In 1902, Ross won a Nobel Prize for research identifying the mechanism of malaria transmission. He carefully demonstrated through a series of experiments that mosquitoes acted as a vector that transmitted malaria from human to human. He also demonstrated that reducing the population of mosquitoes and destroying stagnant bodies of water, which were their breeding grounds, could limit malaria in a local area. Despite this success, Ross remained troubled. He recognised that one could not eliminate all mosquitoes. Did this mean that malaria could not be fully eliminated in a local area? Based on field experience, he hypothesised that this was not true. For a better understanding, he turned away from experimentation and toward mathematics. He began by recognising that in order for a malaria epidemic to occur, there had to be a sufficient population of mosquitoes coupled with a sufficient population of people who were not immune to being infected. He called these non-immune people susceptible. Further, the mosquitoes had to survive long enough for the parasite that causes malaria to reproduce within the mosquito. If there were too few susceptible people, or if there were too few mosquitoes, or if the lifespan of mosquitoes was too short, his mathematics showed that a local epidemic would disappear. William Kermack and Anderson McKendrick developed Ross's theories further with more exact mathematical analysis. Much of their work can be summarised in a simple manner and represented by the most important letter in epidemiology, R, which stands for the reproduction number. It is defined as the average number of new infections created by each infected person during the course of infection. For instance, if each infected person passes the infection to 3 others on average, then the reproduction number is 3. The reproduction number of infectious disease can be thought of in the same way that an ecologist considers the growth of a species, say rabbits, in a particular habitat, like a forest. If each rabbit in a forest has more than one offspring over the course of its life on average, then the rabbit population grows larger in each generation. If each rabbit has fewer than one offspring on average, then the rabbit population dwindles and eventually disappears. Kermack and McKendrick showed that epidemics work the same way. Imagine that you become infected with influenza. Before you realise that you are sick, you infect 2 co-workers. One of these co-workers infects a spouse and a child in their home. The other infects 2 people that they meet at a pub after work. In this example, the reproduction number is 2. Your initial infection has grown from 1 infection, you, to 2, your co-workers, and then to 4, the spouse, child, and 2 friends at the pub, in each successive step of this mini-epidemic. Whether an epidemic grows or shrinks depends on whether the reproduction number is larger or smaller than 1. If each infected person creates more than 1 new infection on average, then an epidemic grows. This happened with your influenza infection. If the reproduction number is less than 1, then an epidemic shrinks and dies out. Suppose that 8 people are infected and the reproduction number is only 1/2. 8 infections become 4. 4 becomes 2, 2 becomes 1, and the epidemic disappears. Mathematical epidemiologist Adam Kucharski has a simple way of describing the key elements that compose the reproduction number with the acronym DOTS. D measures the duration of the infection. The longer someone is ill, the longer the period of time that they can infect new people. O measures the opportunities for infection to spread. The more interactions with other people that someone has, the larger the number of people that they can infect. Each day, an infected person has the opportunity to infect members of their household, co-workers, friends, and random people sitting at tables near them during lunch in a restaurant or sitting near them on a city bus. These are all opportunities for an infection to spread. T measures the probability of transmission. It tells the likelihood that a non-immune person is infected each time they interact with an infectious person. When someone sneezes near a co-worker, sometimes the co-worker becomes infected and sometimes the co-worker does not become infected. S measures the fraction of the population that is susceptible, not immune, to infection. It tells the fraction of people in the population who are available to infect. If more children in a school are effectively vaccinated against measles, fewer children are able to become infected if an outbreak occurs. The size of each of these 4 factors helps to determine whether an infected person spreads a given infection to 2 people, 10 people, or no one. If we assume that people interact in a random manner, like people mixing together on a city bus or train, then the reproduction number can be calculated by multiplying these 4 factors. Whenever this product is larger than 1, the epidemic grows. Whenever it is less than 1, the epidemic shrinks. Whenever one of these factors grows larger for a given infectious disease, so too does the associated epidemic. Of course, real-world epidemics are more complex. Infectious disease involves more nuanced features of spread, such as asymptomatic transmission and latent states of disease. In addition, the interactions of people are not random. You interact with your family, neighbours and co-workers far more frequently than others in the population. Some people, like bus drivers, interact with many people at work. A late-night janitor interacts with only a few. These complications make the reproduction number more difficult to calculate in a real-world epidemic. However, despite these complications and others like them, the reproduction number provides a guide to understanding how infectious disease spreads from person to person, how fast it does so, and how large we can expect an epidemic to be. We saw the elements of the reproduction number present in the Naples cholera epidemics. People compressed together in a small living space created more opportunities for infections to spread. Unsanitary disposal of human waste made each of those opportunities more likely to result in transmission.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?